The secret life of a billionaire nobody knew existed. Ellis Webb was a man of few words. He spent most of his days mopping the hallways and replacing flickering light bulbs at Cedar Creek High, where he had worked as a janitor for nearly 25 years. In his green coveralls, with his salt and pepper hair tucked under a faded baseball cap, he looked like any other aging handyman, a relic of a simpler time. He arrived at 6 a.m. every morning, unlocking doors and sweeping away yesterday's dust before the first bell rang. He never missed a day of work, never asked for a raise, and never drew attention to himself. Students barely noticed him, save for a polite thanks when he held the door open or retrieved a lost scarf from the lost and found box. But there were whispers. "Did you see the car he drives?" One senior asked another as they passed him in the hallway. Parked in the far corner of the lot, hidden behind rows of rusty sedans and aging SUVs, was a sleek, cherry-red 1967 Mustang Shelby GT 500. It gleamed like new, its polished chrome wheels catching the sunlight. "Bet he stole it," the other student joked, shrugging it off. Ellis, overhearing, chuckled softly. If only they knew. His routine was as predictable as the sunrise, but Ellis harbored a secret, a truth so incredible it would have left the entire town slack-jawed. Underneath his modest exterior lay a carefully curated life of extravagance, power, and mystery. He owned things no janitor should, lived a life no one suspected, and held dreams that were bigger than the small town he called home. "Morning, Mr. Webb," chirped a teacher rushing by. Ellis nodded politely, pocketing his keys. He had work to do, at school and elsewhere. When the halls were quiet and the school lights dimmed, Ellis would retreat to a small, windowless office. He'd pull out a black leather journal, worn at the edges, and start jotting down notes. In this journal were numbers, addresses, and ideas that spoke to a life beyond mops and buckets, a life worth billions. Ellis Webb thought he had perfected the art of invisibility. But in a small town like Cedar Creek, even the faintest ripple could send waves of curiosity through the tight-knit community. It started small, just passing remarks between students and teachers. "Did you see the janitor's car? Looks brand new, but it's vintage," one senior girl whispered in class. "My dad says those things cost a fortune." Her classmates scoffed. "No way. Probably a kit car or something." Then there was the matter of his habits. Ellis never seemed flustered by life's usual annoyances. When the town's water main burst, flooding several blocks of Main Street, people lined up at the hardware store for supplies. But Ellis? He strolled in calm as ever, paying in crisp $100 bills for industrial-grade sump pumps. The most curious thing of all was his absence from local gossip. He lived alone in a modest cottage on the outskirts of town, rarely hosting visitors or attending events. Yet somehow, he always knew what was happening in Cedar Creek. People began to wonder, who was Ellis Webb, really? The first real clue came during an unremarkable afternoon in April. Clara Baines, a history teacher at Cedar Creek High, was scrolling through county property records while researching a lesson on local development. Her brow furrowed when a familiar name appeared on her screen. "Ellis Webb," she murmured aloud. The record showed he owned 3 properties downtown: a small office building, an apartment complex, and an empty warehouse by the old train station. She leaned closer, reading the details. His name wasn't listed as part of a trust or business entity. No, these properties were owned outright by him. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The Ellis Webb she knew couldn't possibly be the same man who controlled such valuable real estate. Yet there was in black and white. Unable to resist, she did a deeper dive. To her astonishment, his name appeared again and again, linked to other parcels of land, LLCs, and even a few development projects in nearby towns. She leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. What in the world is the janitor doing with all this? That evening, Clara confided in her nephew, Ryan, a college student with a knack for tech sleuthing. Over pizza and soda, she showed him the record she had found. "This guy owns so much," Ryan said, scrolling through his laptop. "And it's not just property. Look at this. He's listed as a silent partner in a string of local businesses. Coffee shops, boutiques, even the car dealership." Clara stared at the screen, her stomach knotting. She thought about Ellis, the quiet man who never missed a day of work. She'd passed him countless times in the hall, never giving him more than a second thought. Who was he? That night, as Cedar Creek slept, whispers began to take root. From the high school faculty lounge to the local diner, rumors of the janitor's mysterious fortune spread like wildfire. Ellis, oblivious to the growing buzz, carried on as usual. But he wasn't as invisible as he believed. The following week, Cedar Creek buzzed with speculation about Ellis Webb. At the school, students whispered about him in hushed tones, and teachers exchanged curious glances when he passed by. Ellis, however, remained unfazed. He went about his duties as if he hadn't become the center of a growing mystery. Clara Baines couldn't shake her curiosity. Her initial discovery had sent her down a rabbit hole of research. With Ryan's help, she unearthed even more surprising details. Ellis wasn't just a property owner. He was a prolific investor. The warehouse he owned by the old train station, recently leased to a startup manufacturing company. The small office building downtown, home to several thriving businesses, all paying rent directly to him. "I don't get it," Ryan muttered, scrolling through yet another set of records on his laptop. "This guy is loaded. Why is he working as a janitor?" Clara shrugged. "Maybe he likes the simplicity. Or maybe he's hiding something." Ryan smirked. "What, like a double life? You think he's some kind of secret agent?" Clara laughed, but couldn't deny the thought intrigued her. "I don't know. But people don't just end up with this kind of money by accident. Something doesn't add up." Meanwhile, Ellis continued his quiet life, blissfully unaware that Clara and Ryan were piecing together the threads of his hidden fortune. Every evening, after his janitorial duties were done, Ellis would drive to one of his properties, a small, unassuming rental house on Elm Street. There, he would sit in a cozy study, surrounded by books and ledgers, meticulously tracking his investments. This wasn't just a hobby for Ellis, it was a craft. He had spent decades building his empire, starting with a single small purchase, an abandoned duplex he'd bought at an auction for $5,000. Over the years, through careful planning and relentless discipline, that one property had multiplied into a portfolio worth tens of millions. He had taught himself everything he needed to know about real estate, stocks, and business strategy through library books and late-night research. But Ellis's wealth wasn't only about numbers. He had a deep sense of purpose, though he kept it buried beneath his humble exterior. Every decision he made, every property he bought, every investment he nurtured was tied to a dream far bigger than himself. Back at the school, Clara's curiosity got the better of her. One afternoon, as Ellis was repairing a broken locker in the hallway, she approached him. "Mr. Webb," she began hesitantly. Ellis turned, his kind eyes crinkling with a polite smile. "Miss Ben, how can I help you?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. "I was just wondering, do you ever, do anything outside of your work here?" Ellis raised an eyebrow, but kept his expression neutral. "I stay busy," he said simply. Clara tried to probe further. "Like hobbies? Or side projects?" Ellis chuckled softly, brushing a bit of dust from his hands. "You could say that." And with that, he returned to his task, leaving Clara with more questions than answers. That evening, Ellis stood in his study, flipping through his leather journal. He glanced out the window, the light of the full moon illuminating his neatly landscaped backyard. His quiet life in Cedar Creek was starting to feel less quiet. He could sense the growing curiosity around him, and though he'd gone to great lengths to keep his wealth a secret, cracks were beginning to show. For the first time in years, Ellis felt a twinge of unease. His secret wasn't as safe as he thought. Ellis Webb had always prided himself on staying in the background. But even the best-kept secrets can unravel when the smallest mistake is made. For Ellis, that mistake came during a routine Parent-Teacher Association (PTA) meeting. The school gymnasium was packed with parents, teachers, and community members, all gathered to discuss a new budget shortfall. The school roof, riddled with leaks and long overdue for repair, had become a pressing concern. Principal Hart stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "We've exhausted every possible source of funding," Hart said, his voice tinged with frustration. Unless we can raise $50,000 in the next 2 months, these repairs won't happen. And frankly, that's a cost this school simply can't afford. The crowd murmured uneasily. Parents whispered about fundraisers and bake sales, but everyone knew that kind of money wouldn't be easy to come by. Clara Bain sat near the back, arms folded, her mind drifting to the enigmatic janitor. She glanced over at Ellis, who was quietly stacking chairs in the corner, as he often did during meetings. Suddenly, Ellis raised his hand. The room fell silent. It was rare for the janitor to speak at these events, and his calm demeanor immediately commanded attention. "I'll cover it," Ellis said, his voice steady. A stunned hush swept over the gymnasium. Principal Hart blinked, clearly unsure if he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Webb. Did you say?" "I'll donate the $50,000, Ellis repeated matter-of-factly. He pulled a checkbook from his pocket and began writing. "You can have the funds by tomorrow." Gasps echoed through the room. People exchanged bewildered looks, whispering furiously. Clara sat frozen in her seat, her earlier suspicions now fully ignited. "Ellis," Principal Hart stammered, stepping away from the podium. "That's incredibly generous, but are you sure? That's a substantial amount of money." Ellis simply smiled, tearing the check from his book and handing it over. "The school's given me a lot over the years. It's the least I can do." The murmurs grew louder as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Parents were already pulling out their phones, texting friends and family about the janitor who had just pledged an unimaginable sum. By the time the meeting ended, Ellis was the talk of the town. Clara approached him cautiously as he stacked the last of the chairs. "That was impressive, Mr. Webb," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Ellis shrugged, sliding his checkbook into his pocket. It needed to be done. She hesitated, then asked the question everyone was thinking. "How can you afford something like that?" Ellis smiled faintly, but didn't answer. "Have a good evening, Miss Baines," he said, walking past her and out the door. By the next morning, news of Ellis's donation had spread like wildfire. The local paper ran a story with the headline, "Humble Janitor Saves School Roof with $50,000 Gift." Social media buzzed with speculation about his mysterious wealth. Was he a lottery winner? An eccentric heir? A secret investor? Ellis tried to maintain his routine, but the questions followed him wherever he went. Students stopped him in the hall to ask if he was rich. Teachers cornered him in the staff lounge, trying to pry details from him. Even Principal Hart, grateful as he was, couldn't resist hinting at his curiosity during their next conversation. But Ellis gave away nothing. He continued to mop floors, replace light bulbs, and blend into the background. Yet, deep down, he knew the walls around his secret life were beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, Clara and Ryan were hard at work, piecing together more of Ellis's story. Ryan had tracked down property records dating back decades, revealing Ellis's remarkable rise from a modest real estate purchase to a sprawling empire. Clara, intrigued by his reticence, began to wonder if Ellis's secret went beyond mere wealth. Was he hiding something darker? Something dangerous? For Ellis, the donation had been a necessary act of kindness. But it had also been a slip, a momentary lapse in judgment that exposed the truth he had worked so hard to conceal. And now, the world was beginning to notice. The school roof repairs were underway, thanks to Ellis Webb's generous donation. But the mystery surrounding the janitor's wealth had only deepened. By now, nearly everyone in Cedar Creek had heard the story. Rumors ranged from plausible to outrageous. Some claimed Ellis was an eccentric millionaire in hiding. Others said he had discovered a buried treasure, and a few even suggested he was a fugitive using the town as a cover. But Clara Baines wasn't content with rumors. Sitting in her cluttered home office, she pored over the evidence she and Ryan had gathered. There were the property deeds, of course, evidence of a vast real estate portfolio, but there were also breadcrumbs pointing to other ventures. Ellis had stakes in multiple small businesses, including a logistics company in a neighboring town and a boutique hotel chain several states away. "Who even is this guy?" Ryan muttered, leaning back in his chair. He had spent hours tracking Ellis's financial web and still couldn't see the full picture. Clara tapped her pen against her notepad, her mind racing. "We're missing something. People don't just fall into this kind of wealth by accident. Ryan turned his laptop toward her, showing an old newspaper clipping. Check this out. This is from the early 90s, about some developer who bought up abandoned properties in Cedar Creek for pennies on the dollar. Look at the name. Clara squinted at the article. There it was buried in the text. Ellis Webb, local entrepreneur, acquires historic downtown building. He's been doing this for decades, Clara murmured, the pieces slowly falling into place. Buying low, fixing up properties and flipping them. He's been building his empire right under our noses. But there was more. Clara felt certain of it. As she continued digging, she stumbled across something that sent a chill down her spine. An article from a larger city newspaper about a failed investment group that had gone bankrupt nearly 30 years ago. Several investors had lost everything, except one. The article didn't name names, but the description of the sole investor, who had quietly cashed out before the collapse, bore a striking resemblance to Ellis Webb. Ryan, look at this, Clara said, showing him the article. If this is him, he didn't just build wealth. He was smart, too smart. He got out before things went south. What if he's been playing the long game all this time? Ryan frowned. That's great for him. But why stay here? Why hide all this money in a town like Cedar Creek? Clara had been asking herself the same question. She glanced at the stack of printed documents on her desk, wondering if there was a clue she had missed. Meanwhile, Ellis was in his small study, flipping through his journal. The leather-bound book was a treasure trove of his thoughts and plans, a detailed record of every property he had purchased, every investment he had made, and every lesson he had learned along the way. But it wasn't just a financial ledger. On its final pages, it held something more personal, a dream he had carried for decades. The dream wasn't about money. It was about Cedar Creek, the town he had come to love. Ellis had grown up in a forgotten corner of the state, in a family that had struggled to make ends meet. He knew what it felt like to go without, how it felt to dream of opportunities that seemed impossibly out of reach. And so, as his wealth grew, Ellis made a decision. He would use it to change lives. Quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to himself, he would invest in the town and its people. But now, his anonymity was slipping away. Clara wasn't the only one digging into his past. In the shadows, others were taking notice too, people with less noble intentions. One evening, as Ellis sat by his window, watching the sun set over Cedar Creek, he felt a creeping sense of unease. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was an unknown number. When he answered, a cold voice greeted him. "Mr. Webb, you've done a good job staying under the radar. But secrets like yours don't stay hidden forever. We need to talk." Ellis's heart sank. He had spent years outsmarting the system, building something remarkable without drawing attention. But now his secret life was unraveling, and someone out there wanted more than just answers. Ellis Webb sat in the dark of his study, the weight of the mysterious phone call pressing heavily on him. The voice had been calm, almost cordial, but its message was unmistakably threatening. He knew this day would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't happen so soon. The call dredged up memories he had tried to bury, of a life built not just on careful planning, but also on sacrifice and loss. Ellis had grown up in a forgotten corner of Kansas, the youngest of 5 children in a family that barely scraped by. His father was a factory worker, his mother a seamstress. They worked hard but had nothing to show for it. The family's modest home had been taken when Ellis was 12, after his father lost his job during an economic downturn. That experience shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. Never depend on anyone else, his father had told him bitterly, the night they packed up their belongings. This world doesn't give second chances. Ellis took that advice to heart. By the time he was 18, he was working 3 jobs, saving every dollar he earned. He didn't just dream of escaping poverty. He was determined to outsmart it. His big break came when he stumbled upon a mentor, a grizzled real estate agent named Harvey Crane. Harvey saw promise in the scrappy young man and took him under his wing, teaching him the ins and outs of the property market. "You don't need to be rich to start," Harvey would say. "You just need to be smarter than the guy selling." Ellis learned quickly. His first property, a dilapidated duplex, had been a gamble, but it paid off. He spent months fixing it up, doing the work himself to save money. When he sold it for a tidy profit, something clicked. This wasn't just about earning a living. It was about creating opportunities no one else could see. Over the years, Ellis's empire grew. He made bold, calculated risks, investing in distressed properties and undervalued assets. He diversified into stocks, small businesses, and even international ventures. But he never flaunted his success. Instead, he lived frugally, funneling his earnings into more investments. The voice on the phone interrupted his reverie. "Mr. Webb, we know about your holdings. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, properties across state lines, impressive work. But you've made some enemies along the way." Ellis clenched his jaw. "Who are you?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say I represent interested parties. Some people think you owe them, and others? Well, they just don't like a man with secrets." The call ended abruptly, leaving Ellis staring at the phone. He had worked so hard to stay off the radar, to avoid the pitfalls of fame and greed. But it seemed his success had caught up with him. The next morning, Ellis did something he hadn't done in years. He called an old friend. Harvey Crane's voice was gravelly but warm, a stark contrast to the sinister tone of the previous night's call. "Well, if it isn't Ellis Webb," Harvey said. "What's got you digging up fossils like me?" Ellis hesitated. "I've got a situation. Someone's threatening me, threatening everything I've built." Harvey sighed. "I told you, kid. Success is a magnet for trouble." "What do they want?" "I don't know yet," Ellis admitted. "But I need to make sure they don't find out how deep this goes." Harvey was silent for a moment. "You've got two choices. Fight back or cut ties. But knowing you, I doubt you'll take the easy way out." Ellis hung up with a renewed sense of determination. He had faced hardships before. This was just another challenge to overcome. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. At Cedar Creek High, Clara and Ryan were making progress in their own investigation. Ryan had tracked down a name connected to one of Ellis's shell companies, Harvey Crane. "Do you think he's some kind of partner?" Ryan asked, showing Clara the records. Clara's brow furrowed. "Maybe. Or maybe he's the key to understanding who Ellis really is." Unbeknownst to Clara, the stakes were higher than she realized. Ellis wasn't just fighting to protect his wealth. He was fighting to protect Cedar Creek. Over the years, he had quietly funneled millions into the town, investing in everything from the local library to scholarships for underprivileged students. He didn't just want to build a fortune. He wanted to build a legacy. But now, that legacy was under threat. The call had been a warning, but Ellis suspected it wouldn't be the last. He needed to act quickly to safeguard what he had built, not just for himself, but for the town he loved. As he sat in his study, poring over his journal, Ellis made a decision. He would come out of the shadows, not completely, but enough to face his adversaries head-on. It was time to protect his secret life before it unraveled completely. Ellis Webb wasn't a man who often took risks outside of his carefully calculated ventures. But the mysterious phone call had forced his hand. The quiet life he had built in Cedar Creek was in jeopardy. And if he didn't act decisively, everything he had worked for, his empire, his vision for the town, could come crashing down. His first move was to tighten his circle. He met Harvey Crane at a diner on the outskirts of town. Harvey hadn't aged gracefully, but his sharp wit and street smarts were as strong as ever. Over black coffee and scrambled eggs, Ellis laid out the situation. "They know too much," Ellis said, keeping his voice low. "My accounts, my properties, they've done their homework." Harvey frowned, his weathered face creasing further. "Sounds like professionals. Could be corporate sharks, maybe someone from your past investments. Or someone local," Ellis added grimly. "I've stayed invisible, but donating that money, it stirred the pot." Harvey nodded slowly. "All right, first things first. Lock down your assets. Anything they don't know about yet, keep it that way. And if they come at you again, don't fold. You've got leverage. They don't know everything." Ellis leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Harvey was right. Whoever these people were, they didn't have all the pieces. And as long as Ellis controlled the narrative, he had the upper hand. Back in Cedar Creek, the whispers about Ellis's wealth had reached a fever pitch. At the high school, students joked about their billionaire janitor, while teachers speculated about his true identity. Clara Baines and Ryan, however, weren't laughing. They had uncovered too much to dismiss the situation as harmless gossip. Ryan showed Clara his latest discovery, a series of offshore accounts linked to one of Ellis's shell corporations. "This guy isn't just wealthy," Ryan said, shaking his head. "He's next-level careful. He's been hiding his money for years." "But why?" Clara asked. "Why go to such lengths to keep it a secret? If I had that kind of money, I wouldn't be scrubbing floors." Ryan shrugged. Maybe he's running from something. Or someone. Clara's gut told her there was more to the story. She decided to confront Ellis directly. That afternoon, she found him in the school's maintenance room, repairing a faulty water fountain. The space smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and oil, and Ellis looked up from his workbench with his usual calm demeanor. "Miss Baines," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I do for you?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to begin. "Ellis, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me a straight answer." He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I know about the properties," she said, her voice steady, "and the businesses. I know you're not just a janitor. So, why are you here? Why hide all of this?" Ellis sighed, setting down his tools. For a moment, he considered denying everything, but he saw the determination in her eyes. Clara wasn't going to let this go. "Because it's not about the money," he said finally. "It never was." Clara blinked, surprised by his candor. "Then what is it about?" Ellis gestured for her to sit on a nearby stool. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "I grew up with nothing," he began. "No safety net, no opportunities. Everything I built because I didn't want anyone else to feel that hopeless. This town is special. It's where I wanted to make a difference." Clara was silent, absorbing his words. "So all of this, your investments, your secrecy, it's for Cedar Creek?" Ellis nodded. "If people knew, they'd treat me differently. They'd try to take advantage or tear it down. I've seen it happen before. Staying invisible was the only way to protect what I've built." Before Clara could respond, Ellis's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. It was another unknown number. "Excuse me," he said, stepping out of the room to take the call. This time, the voice was less cordial. "We warned you, Mr. Webb. You ignored us. Now it's going to cost you." "What do you want?" Ellis demanded, keeping his voice low. "Your cooperation," the voice replied. "And a slice of the pie. Meet us tomorrow, 8 p.m., at the old train station. Bring everything we need to make this right." The line went dead. That evening, Ellis sat in his study, weighing his options. He could play along, meet these shadowy figures, and try to negotiate. Or he could take Harvey's advice and fight back, using his resources to outmaneuver them. But both options carried risks, not just for him, but for Cedar Creek. As he opened his leather journal, his gaze fell on a handwritten note. "Leave a legacy, not a trail." Ellis closed the book with a determined sigh. Tomorrow, at the train station, he would confront the people who threatened his life's work. And this time, he wouldn't back down. The old train station was a relic of another era. Its cracked brick walls and boarded windows bore the weight of decades of neglect. By the time Ellis arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty lot. He parked his car a block away and approached the meeting spot cautiously, his senses on high alert. Ellis wasn't one to walk into a trap unprepared. Tucked inside his jacket was a small recording device, its red light blinking faintly. In his pocket, he carried a burner phone with Harvey's number on speed dial. If things went south, Harvey would know what to do. The platform was deserted except for two men standing under the dim glow of a broken street lamp. Both wore dark suits and carried an air of authority that Ellis immediately recognized as dangerous. They weren't amateurs. "You're punctual," one of them said as Ellis approached. His voice matched the one on the phone, cold and calculated. Ellis stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands in his pockets. "I'm here. Now tell me what this is about." The second man stepped forward, his expression sharp. "You've been very busy, Mr. Webb. Offshore accounts, shell companies, properties in every corner of the state. You've done well for yourself. Too well." Ellis's jaw tightened. "If you know so much about me, then you know I've earned every penny. What do you want?" The first man smirked. "A partnership. You've built something remarkable, but you've done it alone. That kind of independence doesn't sit well with certain organizations. Share a piece of the pie, and we'll make sure you stay out of trouble. Ellis's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. And if I refuse? The smirk disappeared. Then we take what we need, and you lose everything. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of a freight train passing through the outskirts of town. Ellis's mind raced. These men weren't bluffing. They had the resources and connections to dismantle his empire, piece by piece, if he didn't comply. But giving in wasn't an option. Everything he had built, the investments, the businesses, the quiet support for Cedar Creek, was rooted in his independence. He couldn't let these men take control. Ellis squared his shoulders. I don't take orders from bullies. If you want my cooperation, you'll have to earn it. The second man chuckled darkly. You got guts, Webb. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. Before Ellis could respond, a loud clang echoed through the station. He turned sharply, his heart pounding. But it was only a loose piece of metal falling from the rafters. The distraction was enough to throw him off balance. And in that moment, the men stepped closer. You're making a mistake, the first man hissed. You think you can outsmart us? We've handled bigger fish than you. Ellis felt a surge of anger. He had spent his life outthinking challenges, turning setbacks into opportunities. These men might have power, but they underestimated his resolve. I've been underestimated my whole life, Ellis said, his voice calm but firm. It's what makes me dangerous. With that, he pulled the burner phone from his pocket and pressed a button. Instantly, a loud alarm blared, echoing through the station. The men flinched, startled, as Ellis took a step back. What? That's your warning, Ellis said, his tone icy. Next time, it won't be an alarm. The men exchanged glances, their confidence shaken. They hadn't expected Ellis to fight back, and for now, it seemed they weren't prepared to escalate. Without another word, they turned and walked away, their shadows disappearing into the darkness. Ellis watched them go, his heart still racing. He knew this wasn't over. These men weren't the type to give up easily, and their parting words echoed in his mind. You lose everything. Later that night, Ellis met Harvey in a diner on the outskirts of town. The older man listened intently as Ellis recounted the meeting, his expression grim. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Harvey said, shaking his head. These guys aren't just after your money. They want control. Ellis nodded. Then we'll make it impossible for them to take it. Harvey leaned forward, his voice low. You've got to play this smart. Move your assets, tighten your defenses, and figure out who these guys are. They're not just some thugs. They've got connections. Ellis sighed, his determination hardening. I've faced worse. They won't take what I've built. But deep down, he knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about his wealth anymore. It was about protecting the people and the town he cared about. And as the shadows around him grew darker, Ellis resolved to fight harder than he ever had before. Ellis Webb spent the next few days preparing for the battle ahead. He knew the men at the train station weren't bluffing. If they couldn't strong-arm him into compliance, they would try other, more insidious methods. It was time to act, not just to protect himself, but to secure the legacy he had spent decades building. His first move was to safeguard his empire. He transferred assets into anonymous trusts, moved liquid funds into secure accounts, and arranged for contingency plans should anything happen to him. Harvey helped him set up layers of legal protection, creating a maze of ownership that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to dismantle his holdings without his approval. But Ellis didn't stop there. He knew that secrecy alone wouldn't be enough to stop his enemies. He needed to shift the narrative, turn the focus away from himself and toward something bigger. 2 weeks later, Cedar Creek woke up to startling news. Ellis Webb, the quiet, unassuming janitor, had purchased an entire block of struggling businesses downtown. Local coffee shops, a hardware store, and a dilapidated community theater, all on the brink of closure, were now under his ownership. And the best part? He announced that he would slash their rents in half and provide grants to help them thrive. The town buzzed with excitement and confusion. For years, Ellis had been invisible, a background figure no one paid much attention to. Now he was stepping into the spotlight as an unlikely hero. At the community theater, workers were already busy repairing the roof, and replacing broken seats. A reporter from the Cedar Creek Gazette caught up with Ellis as he supervised the renovations. "Mr. Webb," the reporter began, holding out a microphone. "Why now? Why invest so much in our town all of a sudden?" Ellis smiled faintly. "It's not sudden. I've always cared about Cedar Creek. This town has potential. It just needs a little support." The reporter pressed on. "But why stay under the radar all these years? Surely someone with your resources could have made a bigger impact sooner." Ellis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the best way to help is quietly. But now, well, the time felt right to step forward. It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough to satisfy the reporter. The story ran the next day with the headline, "Local Janitor Revealed as Town's Hidden Benefactor." Meanwhile, Clara Baines and Ryan were still trying to piece together the bigger picture. Clara sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and notes, while Ryan scrolled through news articles on his laptop. "I don't get it," Ryan said, shaking his head. "He's giving away millions. Why? What's the angle?" Clara tapped her pen against her notebook, her mind racing. "It's not about an angle. I think he's trying to protect something. Or maybe someone." Ryan frowned. "Protect from what?" Clara glanced at one of the articles she had highlighted, detailing the sudden resurgence of activity at the old train station. She hadn't connected it to Ellis before, but now it seemed significant. "I don't know," she said slowly. "But whatever it is, I think it's bigger than we realize." Ellis's enemies weren't blind to his moves. From their sleek office in a distant city, the two men who had confronted him at the train station watched his growing public presence with a mix of frustration and amusement. "He's trying to make himself untouchable," one of them said, scrolling through the latest news about Ellis's investments in Cedar Creek. "If the town sees him as a hero, it'll be harder for us to move against him." The other man smirked. "Then we change the strategy. Let him have his moment in the sun. Sooner or later, he'll make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be ready." That evening, Ellis stood on the steps of the newly renovated community theater, addressing a crowd of townspeople. He spoke about the importance of revitalizing Cedar Creek, of giving local businesses the support they needed to thrive. His voice was steady, his demeanor calm, but inside, he felt the weight of the battle he was fighting. After the event, Clara approached him. "Ellis," she said, her tone cautious, "you're doing something incredible here. But I have to ask, what's really going on? Why now?" Ellis studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Ms. Baines, you're a good teacher and a sharp observer. But some things are better left unsaid." Clara frowned. "You're hiding something?" "Perhaps," Ellis admitted. "But for now, let's just say I'm doing what needs to be done." As Clara watched him walk away, she felt a mix of admiration and unease. Whatever Ellis was protecting, it was clear he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Cedar Creek, and he wasn't afraid to risk everything to win. The renovations downtown were nearly complete, and Cedar Creek was buzzing with a newfound sense of hope. Ellis Webb had become a reluctant celebrity, hailed as a local hero for his investments in the town. But behind the scenes, the shadows of his adversaries loomed larger than ever. The two men who had confronted Ellis weren't idle. Their investigations into his financial web had uncovered weak points: unsecured assets, old partnerships, and a small but significant discrepancy in one of his offshore accounts. They planned to use these vulnerabilities to destroy his empire piece by piece, forcing him to comply with their demands. And tonight, they were ready to strike. Ellis had anticipated this. Standing in his study, he flipped through his leather journal one last time, making sure every contingency plan was in place. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, funneling funds into secure trusts, transferring vulnerable properties to anonymous entities, and quietly recruiting allies to help protect what mattered most. His phone buzzed. It was Harvey. "They're making their move," Harvey said without preamble. "Corporate filings show they've launched a claim against one of your shell companies. It's a front. They're testing your defenses." Ellis nodded, his jaw tightening. "And the others?" "So far, holding steady. But they'll come at you from every angle, kid. Be ready." "I always am," Ellis replied before hanging up. That night, Ellis attended the grand reopening of the community theater. The entire town had turned out to celebrate, their spirits lifted by the transformation of the once dilapidated building. Ellis mingled quietly, offering polite smiles and nods to the townsfolk who thanked him for his generosity. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the storm brewing in the distance. Clara Baines was there, too, watching Ellis from across the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His calm demeanor seemed forced, his smile tinged with exhaustion. She decided to follow her instincts and approached him as he stood near the theater's entrance. "Ellis," she said, her tone firm but kind, "I know there's more to this than you're letting on. Whatever's happening, you don't have to face it alone." Ellis studied her for a moment, weighing his response. Finally, he spoke. "Clara, you're right. There's more. But the less you know, the safer you'll be." Before she could press him further, a commotion erupted outside. The doors to the theater burst open, and a man in a suit strode in, flanked by two others. It was the same man who had confronted Ellis at the train station. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth but menacing, "I hate to interrupt, but I'm here on urgent business." The crowd murmured in confusion, and Clara's eyes darted to Ellis. His expression remained calm, but she saw the tension in his posture. "Ellis Webb," the man continued, stepping closer, "we have some unfinished business to discuss." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Ellis. He stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze with quiet resolve. "This isn't the time or place," Ellis said evenly. "If you have something to say, we'll handle it privately." The man smirked. "Oh, I think the time and place are just fine. After all, these people deserve to know the truth about their so-called benefactor." Ellis didn't flinch. "The truth is, I've invested in this town because I believe in its potential. What's your interest here?" The man's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected Ellis to stand his ground so publicly. Before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady. "And why are you trying to undermine someone who's done nothing but help this community?" The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. The townsfolk, emboldened by Clara's words, began murmuring in support of Ellis. The man's attempt to intimidate had backfired spectacularly. "You've made a mistake," the man said finally, his voice low. "This isn't over, Webb." He turned and left, his associates following close behind. As the doors slammed shut behind them, the room erupted in applause for Ellis. But he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Later that night, Ellis met Harvey in a dimly lit office downtown. The older man handed him a thick envelope filled with documents. "They overplayed their hand," Harvey said with a grin. "Turns out these guys have skeletons of their own. A little digging, and we've got enough leverage to make them back off permanently." Ellis thumbed through the documents, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's make sure they know what's at stake if they try anything else." Harvey nodded. "You've done good work, kid. The town's lucky to have you." Ellis smiled faintly. "It's not about luck. It's about leaving something that matters." Over the next few weeks, the tension began to ease. The shadowy organization that had threatened Ellis quietly withdrew, their resources redirected elsewhere. Ellis's defensive maneuvers had worked, and Cedar Creek was safe, for now. At the theater's next event, Clara approached Ellis again. This time, he offered her a genuine smile. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Ellis nodded. "You were right, Clara. Sometimes it helps to have someone else in your corner." As the night wore on, Ellis stood in the back of the theater, watching the crowd laugh and cheer. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. His secrets might not stay hidden forever, but for now, he had protected what mattered most. And as Cedar Creek flourished, the legacy of Ellis Webb grew, quietly, humbly, but undeniably powerful. Thank you so much for watching The Secret Life of a Billionaire Nobody Knew Existed. We hope you enjoyed diving into the mysterious and inspiring journey of Ellis Webb. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. Your support helps us bring you more amazing content. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.